Hey everybody, the next video on our schedule is a festival edition playlist video. It is every year the calendar does this. Every year the calendar rolls around and the next holiday festival on the Jewish and or Christian calendar. I missed Ash Wednesday again, but it was a couple years ago. I did a Lenten video to talk about the season of Lent on the Christian calendar, but I missed it this year. So the next video, the next holiday that comes up, next festival that shows up is the festival of Purim. And we've done lots of videos about Purim, and oftentimes, in most of this playlist, the resources I'm sharing and the thoughts I'm sharing usually often come from Rabbi David Fohrman and his team over at Aleph Beta. And today's going to be no exception. I'll just put a general link to alephbeta.org in the description of my video. It's just a great place for amazing resources. Obviously, if you follow my body of work, if you listen to the podcast, then you know how much Aleph Beta has made a difference for me and how much I've learned from Rabbi David Fohrman. And this is just another one of those instances, and we love promoting their stuff, and you got to get over and listen. A lot of their stuff will require some level of membership. You get a certain amount of minutes and engagement for free, and then there are different levels of membership that allows you to access their resources. And I know that not everybody is looking to pay for resources, but if you have the ability, you will not be disappointed or feel like you wasted that investment. There's just so much great stuff there. When it comes to the story of Purim and the book of Esther, it is, without exaggeration, one of Rabbi Fohrman's, I would say one of the things that he is an expert in, one of the things that he has more teaching on. There are some places that Fohrman teaches more than others, and one of the places that he just teaches so much stuff. And you think, man, you're just going to hear the same stuff, and you don't. He spent so much time in the book of Esther. And just has some dynamite teachings that come out of there. And so the teaching I looked at as I was getting ready for my own Purim observance this year, as I was getting ready for the holiday, I'll often go over and I'll do some learning, and then I'll share some of those things here in these videos. But I do that for my own observance with my own family and those kind of things. And so there was a video that he had that I'm going to link in the description of this video. You probably will need some form of membership to watch the whole thing, but it's 45 minutes long, a 45-minute teaching on one of the pieces of Purim observance. We haven't talked a lot about it in our past videos. We've done a handful of videos on Purim, and I might have mentioned it in one of them in passing, but one of the things that people will do during Purim is they will give gifts. Two different forms of gift giving happen on Purim. They're called mishloach, manot, and metanot, le'ev yonim. I said that backwards. Le'ev yonim. Metanot, le'ev yonim. So there are two ways that you give gifts. One of the ways that you give gifts is you give gifts to each other, like your fellow Jewish brothers and sisters, and you send little gifts of food. And I think the traditional common gift is like a little bag of cookies, or you just give away little gifts of food. And then there's another part of Purim where you're supposed to give away gifts to the poor. So you give away gifts of food and gifts to the poor. Now, this is just a part of Purim observance, and I think a lot of us, myself included, you can assume that, I'm sure that this probably has this practice is rooted somewhere in Jewish wisdom, but I don't really know where it comes from. It just becomes like one of those things you do. You just do this during Purim, but I don't really know why. And it turns out there's actually not a ton of rabbinic teaching on what lies behind as far as textual, where is it rooted in the story? But Rabbi Fohrman goes on this teaching and he says, I want to see if maybe we find these practices in the book of Esther, in the story of Esther and the story of Purim, and whether or not, in his words, they serve as a window into the wisdom of the story and the practice of Purim. And in typical Rabbi Fohrman fashion, he does that. He goes and he says, where does this phrase of mishloach manot, where does it show up? And he goes and he finds the word manot, and he finds the word for, and there's this phrase in Esther 9 where basically the decree is given that I think Mordecai says that everybody should give gifts to their fellow Jews to celebrate Purim. And that command is in the story. And Fohrman goes, have we seen these words before? And he says this command really has three parts. There's every man, so there's the idea of ish in the Hebrew, and then is to give gifts, and those three pieces end up showing up when Esther is chosen by the king in Esther 2. And then there's a couple references even in Esther 1, the story of Vashti. And this idea of friendship that shows up in both places. To your friends, that you would give these gifts to your friends. So in Esther 1 and 2, these three ideas show up kind of within the same block. And in fact, it's when she gets taken into the harem, and there is the leader of the harem, his name is Haggai, and Haggai ends up giving her manot, gifts. He ends up providing her with food and giving her, and that particular phrasing is used in those places. And so Fohrman uses rabbinic tradition to say the suggestion there, and there are hints in the language that would suggest to rabbinic tradition that it's not just Haggai that's giving this to her, but that Mordecai is actually sending these things kind of behind the scenes, undercover. He's the one sending. Haggai's not just giving her these gifts. These gifts are being sent to Esther by Mordecai. And he talks about that. So 45-minute teaching, lots of really great stuff. And then there's this other practice of metanot le'evyonim, the giving gifts to the poor. And that phrase doesn't show up in the story directly. So Fohrman's like, well, I guess there's nothing to learn there. But he says, but wait again, actually, maybe it does show up if we look a little bit harder. And in fact, he says, I think this actually happens when we're told that Esther sends clothes to Mordecai later in the story. Mordecai's found out about this big conspiracy to kill all the Jews, and he goes into mourning, and he goes and he sits outside the king's palace, and Esther ends up hearing that Mordecai is all disheveled. He's got torn clothes because he's in mourning. You tear your clothes, you put ashes, sackcloth, like he looks bad, but she doesn't know why, because she doesn't know about the conspiracy to kill all the Jews. So she thinks maybe Mordecai has fallen on hard times and is suffering in a new experience of poverty. So she sends him gifts to the poor. She sends him clothes to put on, which he refuses, and that ends up leading to the whole conversation, this central conversation between Mordecai and Esther, which is kind of the central conversation of the book and the teaching of Purim, is that Mordecai ends up saying, listen, Esther, Haman's hatched this plot, and the king has okayed it, and all the Jews are going to die. And you don't know that. In the meantime, Esther sends word back to Mordecai saying essentially, yeah, but you don't know what's happened, where neither one of them know what they have gone through. And Fohrman's going to pull this out and talk about what those details are. Esther doesn't know what Mordecai is going through, but Mordecai doesn't know what Esther's situation is. And so she says, listen, you don't understand. I can't just go to the king. So you're worried about your death, but I'm worried about my death. So we all got our problems, right? That's what Fohrman says that at one point in the video. Like, we all got our problems, Mordecai. How about you worry about yours and I'll worry about mine? To which Mordecai has his kind of famous response, for such a time as this. But Fohrman's always done a great job in all of his teaching of saying, Mordecai's response to Esther makes no sense, because what he says is, if you don't do something, Esther, the Jews will be saved some other way, which doesn't make any sense. Like, if I'm trying to convince Esther, I need to tell her, like, Esther, we've got to have your help, because if you don't help us, we're all going to die. But that's the opposite of what he says. Mordecai says, we're all going to be saved. So we don't actually need you, Esther. Like, God will save us one way or another because God's going to save his people. So what is Mordecai doing? Mordecai's not pleading practically for Esther's help. Mordecai believes that salvation is going to come from God. God's going to save and deliver his people. But Mordecai's saying, Esther, this isn't about practicality, it's about you. It's about your own soul. It's about justice. This isn't about the salvation of all of our people. God will take care of that. This is about the salvation of you. It's about who you're becoming. It's about who you are. And it's about doing the right thing, Esther. It's about doing the right thing. He talks about this in a completely different way in the book that I've mentioned in this playlist before, The Queen You Thought You Knew. I'll put a link to all these things in the description of this video. All the links will be there. But he unpacks that in a completely different way. He's done a great job of showing that this is the conversation that's happening between Mordecai and Esther. Esther, this isn't about how we need you. You're the only hope we have. God is our hope. We don't need you. But Esther, this isn't about the fact that you're our only hope. This is about the fact that you need to do the right thing. It's a long story short. Fohrman's case is that this practice of gift giving, this practice of mishloach manot, and this practice of metanot le'evyonim. It's such a hard word to say. I had to write it down. Metanot le'evyonim. These practices of giving gifts of food to each other and these practices of giving gifts to the poor is actually not just a silly holiday practice, but it's one of the central tenets that's inviting us to learn the wisdom of Purim. First of all, we are supposed to remind each other by giving gifts to our fellow brother and sister Jews. We're supposed to remind ourselves of who we are. Because why was Mordecai sending Esther gifts when she got taken into the harem? Because when she gets taken into the harem, she'll never come back. She's not coming back home. She's not going to be attending synagogue. She's not going to be with all of her Jews. She's now going to live in the king's palace for the rest of her life. And what Mordecai is doing is he's sending her gifts to remind her of who she is. Don't ever forget, Esther, who you are. Don't ever forget your Jewish identity. Nobody else needs to know about your Jewish identity. You don't need to tell anybody, but you need to always remember who you are and where you came from. So we give gifts to one another on Purim to remind ourselves of who we are and our Jewish identity. But that identity is also connected to a calling. That identity as Jews is also connected to a calling to do the right thing in the world, to be people that stand up for justice, to be the people that, as Torah would say, remember the alien, the orphan, and the widow because you were slaves in Egypt, and that is why God commands us to do this. So there's our identity, but there's also the calling, the partnership, the responsibility, the participation that's attached to our identity. There's who we are, but then there's how we are in the world. There's who we are, but then there's how we are. And that's why we give gifts to the poor, because of who we are also supposed to take care of those who might find themselves in troubling times or on the fringes or in need of help or in need of justice. Because of who we are, that connects us to the how we are. And I just thought that was that's my summary of what I learned this year as I learned from Rabbi David Fohrman. So I encourage you, if you have a membership, if you don't, to get a membership to appreciate the teaching that you can get from alephbeta.org. I'm going to put that on link in the video here. I'm going to put alephbeta.org in the video there. I'm going to put a link to Rabbi Fohrman's book on Esther in the description of this video. All those things will be there. But I thought that was some good wisdom. Remembering where we came from, remembering our identity, but remembering why our identity matters, because there's who we are and then there's how we are in the world. Hopefully you guys have a great Purim. We'll talk to you the next time a holiday rolls around. See you then.